Oh wow, this Jedi stuff is hard, Obi-Wan. Oh yeah, it's hard work, Anakin. I mean, it's really costing me an arm and a leg. A what? An arm and a leg. Oh, yeah. Imagine that. This video is brought to you by the faithful and wondrous minions of Supreme Leader Mishka over on Patreon. If you'd like to join the Mishkarian Legion for just a couple of dollars a month, then there's a link in the description. So, foreshadowing. A little bit of a different video, because unlike magic systems, final battles, or chosen ones, foreshadowing isn't so much an element of the story as it is a tool in the crafting of a story. And most people have a pretty good idea on what foreshadowing is, but knowing where it's necessary and how to do it effectively is another question entirely, so that's what we'll be focusing on today. Briefly, what is foreshadowing? In its simplest form, foreshadowing is using scenes earlier on in the story to build anticipation and understanding of events later in the story. In Avengers Age of Ultron, Tony Stark uses the phrase "peace in our time" to describe what Ultron could do for the world. This is a reference to Neville Chamberlain's words, who in history's worst case of cringing at your past self said after striking a deal with Hitler he had achieved peace in our time. That let's just say, Blitzkrieg! Those who knew that would anticipate not peace, but a war unlike the world has ever seen. But foreshadowing isn't just an interesting creative detail readers can look back on. It can help a writer structure their story, set the tone, and have more satisfying payoffs for the reader, all of which we'll be getting to later on. First, we should go through the different ways that you can foreshadow. As always, spoilers. There are any number of ways to foreshadow, but we'll be focusing on 6 extremely common ones. The pre-scene, irregular description, Chekhov's gun, symbolism, irregular action, and prophecy. So firstly, the pre-scene. This is where a smaller version of a much more important moment happens earlier on. In Stranger Things, one of the opening scenes depicts the main characters playing a game of Dungeons and Dragons. In the game, they have to fight the Demogorgon, an incredibly powerful monster from another dimension, and then they spend the season fighting a monster from another dimension that they call the Demogorgon. A pre-scene foreshadows a later plot event by mimicking what happens on a much smaller scale, cluing the reader into the type of tension to expect. Secondly, irregular description. This is where the author tends to highlight something that would not usually be examined, or give it more detail than would usually be given. The most obvious example that most people would know of is Harry's scar. In the opening pages of The Philosopher's Stone, not the Sorceress, Rowling writes that the only thing Harry liked about his own appearance was a very thin scar on his forehead that was shaped like a bolt of lightning. He had had it as long as he could remember, and the first question he could ever remember asking his Aunt Petunia was how he had gotten it. Normally, a scar by itself isn't that remarkable, we all have them, but this irregular description signals to the reader that something mysterious happened in his past, but it also foreshadows that the tension in the story will rise from the relationship he has with Voldemort. Unlike the real world, where we see and hear everything in our life, but not all of it matters, writing forces the author to make conscious choices about what to include and what not to include. This means that to have a cohesive story that narrows the reader's focus to what the author wants them to see, every paragraph must serve a purpose in the narrative. Giving an irregular description to something sets it apart as an important focal point for the reader, signaling that something will come of it. In a breakdown of the details of how to write an irregular description, whereas ordinary elements are often described in a list, the irregular object should contrast by being set apart in its own paragraph or sentence. The closer it is to that list, the clearer the contrast will be. Secondly, having a character interact with the object in a way that they don't interact with other things helps set it apart. Maybe they tell a story about it, get more worried about losing it, or have conflicting feelings about it. Thirdly, Chekhov's gun. This is probably the most common and important types of foreshadowing to have in a story. It comes from a writer named Pavlovich Chekhov, who noted that if in Act 1 you have a gun on the wall, then it must fire in the last act. A quote from screenwriter David Trottier in Snyder's book Save the Cat captures this principle pretty well. To paraphrase, a cup of coffee isn't important enough to describe, unless there's poison in it. Chekhov's gun is something introduced in the story earlier on to let the reader know that it will be consequential later in the story. This is a specific thing, usually an object, but it can be anything that will return in the story. This is extremely common in games where you discover a specific item or ability that doesn't seem particularly important until further down the track. In the game Undertale, you can buy food from a spider bake sale near the beginning and use that later on to get out of a fight with the spider boss Muffet. This item seems relatively useless at first, but it foreshadows the meeting with the spiders and the type of game that Undertale is trying to be, one where killing those in your way isn't the only option. Fundamentally, if something is unusually featured in Act 1, then it must come back in Act 3. Chekhov's guns are often important in creating satisfying payoffs and resolving conflict, particularly in science fiction or fantasy. By setting up an element of the magic system, technology, or otherwise beforehand, the reader understands the capabilities it has in the story. This means it doesn't feel like, "a wizard did it," when it's used later on to resolve conflict. Fourthly, symbolism. Foreshadowing can be anywhere on the spectrum between obvious and subtle. Whereas pre-scenes and Chekhov's guns tend to be on the more obvious side to the reader, symbolism tends to be a lot more subtle. A clear and one of my favourite examples of this is the opening scene in A Game of Thrones, where the Starks chance across a direwolf who died killing a stag, the two respective symbols of House Stark and House Baratheon. The mutual death of these two animals is a symbol that causes the reader to anticipate a coming war that would not just engulf both houses, but result in the deaths of nearly all of House Stark and House Baratheon. Symbols can either be internal or external, external being symbols that we use, like the figure 8 being infinity, and internal symbols being ones from the world you've built, like Starks being direwolves. There are extremely obvious and even heavy-handed symbols like how storm clouds equals sad and crows equal dead, but it can be more interesting to use subtle symbols that can be interpreted in a number of different ways. External symbols are useful when an author wishes to more clearly foreshadow future events, while internal symbols may be more subtle or creative. And one of the more effective forms of symbolism foreshadowing is a motif, which often uses the repetition of a symbol throughout the story, and it's that repetition that makes it both noticeable and effective. In Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea, he repeatedly compares his character to Christ, a symbol of self-sacrifice, to foreshadow that in the end, he would sacrifice his own life for others. Fifthly, irregular action. This is where a character acts in a way that is inconsistent with their characterization beforehand, causing the reader to wonder why. A great example of this is in The Lord of the Rings, where the otherwise very likable, bubbly and friendly Bilbo suddenly becomes agitated and angry when Gandalf asks him to leave the One Ring behind. This out-of-character moment foreshadows that the tension will come from various characters struggling with the One Ring, and foreshadows the greater evil of the Dark Lord Sauron himself. The irregular action tactic is most commonly used in the mystery threads of a narrative, where a character acts in a certain way that is only explained later on after the mystery is revealed. And sixthly, there's also prophecies or visions or dreams, which are technically foreshadowing, but they're definitely on the more obvious side of the spectrum. Very few characters doubt the importance of a prophecy, and even if they do, the reader certainly doesn't. So saying, "and one of you shall die watching communist propaganda," is less foreshadowing and more setting up a clear direction for the plot. But there are good examples of this working, like in Shakespeare's play, where the idea that Macbeth believes he cannot be killed by a man born of a woman plays a crucial role in his decisions throughout the story. Though we discussed the disadvantages and advantages of prophecies more generally in the on-writing video on Chosen Ones, so if you want to know more about that, then I recommend you go check that out. Other ways to foreshadow include simple phraseology, like when Catelyn Stark states in A Game of Thrones, sometimes she felt as though her heart had turned to stone, foreshadowing the appearance of Lady Stoneheart. Otherwise, irrationally worrying or joking about something happening, like in Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Or maybe they'll unleash a crazy amazing spirit attack on the Fire Nation. Or wisdom, that's good too.
And lo and behold, next episode, Fish Giant Karate Chop. But broadly, these tend to be clever turns of phrase that a reader will only notice on a second reading. There are any number of ways to foreshadow effectively, some more subtle than others, and some more creative than others. Which style you use will be determined by the effect you want to have on the reader. Now let's talk through foreshadowing and three things: structure, tone, and payoff. Firstly, narrative structure. Foremost, foreshadowing allows the author to emphasize certain dramatic threads in the story, and this emphasis creates an expectation for the reader about what the important dramatic events in the story will be, whether they're a divorce, a murder, or a nuclear war. Now, these dramatic moments typically happen at the end of the first, second, or third act. In The Dark Knight, Harvey Dent says this famous line at the beginning:
"You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain."
The viewer didn't know who, where, when, why, or how it would come to be, but this line created an expectation that this idea would be central to the development of the tension in the story, which it did at the end of the second act when Harvey Dent became Two-Face. It foreshadowed one of the major dramatic events that the story is structured around. The best way to put it I've found is that foreshadowing shows the reader the shape of what is to come, but not precisely what happens. It acts as connective tissue in the narrative, linking the first, second, and third acts by creating an expectation for the reader of the dramatic moments that take place in each of them. A story will feel more cohesive when the reader anticipates what could happen beforehand. Though it is crucial to note, this does not mean that they know what will happen. This means that they know where the tension will come from in the story, whether it be in a relationship breakdown, a mystery being solved, or Putin arriving with an army of bears. Foreshadowing guides the reader's experience. Secondly, tone. Foreshadowing allows an author to lay the foundations for a shift in tone that happens later in the story. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, one of the opening lines is, "The old scar on his forehead, which was shaped like a bolt of lightning, was burning beneath his fingers, as though someone had just pressed a white-hot wire to his skin." This is an instance of pre-scene foreshadowing, that despite the upbeat, happy beginning to the story with the Quidditch World Cup, it foreshadows a much darker tone to the story, which happens soon enough with the attack of the Death Eaters. But it also foreshadows the shift in the series more generally, as Goblet is regarded as ending with the greatest tonal shift throughout all of the books. On top of this, it's a pre-scene of one of the darkest moments in the series yet. Just as he describes his scar burning beneath his fingers, it mimics the event in the climax of the story, where Harry felt the cold tip of Voldemort's white long finger touch him, and he thought his head would burst with pain. It can be jarring for a reader to experience a dramatic shift in tone that comes out of nowhere. This does not mean that plot twists should be expected, as they are often most effective when accompanied by shifts in tone. However, if this shift isn't foreshadowed, then the event itself that changes the tone can feel disconnected from the story beforehand. Foreshadowing tonal shifts also creates a sense of intrigue for the reader, as they anticipate that important coming event. This can add suspense to parts of the story that feel less intense. And thirdly, satisfying payoffs. It's always interesting to find creative foreshadowing that builds theme or character, and there's nothing wrong with that. But which events you need to foreshadow for a good story is a whole other, more difficult question. But fundamentally, foreshadowing is not just giving information to the reader. Across all of the types, and whether used for tone or narrative structure, foreshadowing is needed to make unexpected events believable. A satisfying payoff means the reader feels the resolution to the problem was set up in a way that makes sense. This also means that the more important the event, the more it needs to be foreshadowed beforehand throughout the story. Pre-scenes are often used to make tonal shifts believable, irregular action is often used to make the reveal of a murderer believable, symbolism is often used to make the climaxes at the end of an act believable, and irregular descriptions of an object are often used to make how a character solves a problem with that object later on believable. So what have we discussed about foreshadowing? 1. There are any number of ways to foreshadow: pre-scene, symbolism, Chekhov's guns, irregular description, irregular action, prophecy, and many more. They each have their strengths. 2. Foreshadowing can help to establish narrative structure by setting up the expectations of where the tension will arise in the future. It becomes connective tissue between the first, second, and third acts. 3. Foreshadowing can help establish tone and create intrigue and suspense during less dramatic moments in the story. And 4. While there are plenty of places foreshadowing works well, it is only needed to make unexpected events believable, whether it be tonal shifts, plot twists, character changes, or climactic resolutions. But that is all from me. If you'd like to support our Supreme Leader Mishka and join the Mishkarian Legion, where we serve faithfully, loyally, artistically, and for life, then there is a link to that in the description for just a couple of dollars per month. Question of the day: how did you creatively foreshadow something in your story? Let me know down in the comments below. In the meantime, I'd love for you to come follow me over on Twitter or Facebook, or email my stuff to your mail address and links in the description below. Stay nerdy, Subfuries, and I will see you in the future.